The letter arrived without a subject. No greeting. Just the meeting time and the sender's initials. At 8:14 in the morning, when the city had not yet decided whether this day would be ordinary, I stared at the screen longer than I should have. At 60, such messages are not sent to ask how your weekend was. They come when someone, somewhere, has decided that your trajectory needs adjustment. Not because you made a mistake, but because you no longer fit. I finished my cold coffee and did not reread it. Repetition would not reveal new meanings. The call was not about discussing a project. It was about me. The corridors in the head office always looked the same: glass, metal, light without shadow. A space where nothing holds the gaze. I knew this route by heart. I had walked it hundreds of times over 27 years. But that morning, it felt different. Not longer. Quieter. The people I met smiled. A little longer than usual. And almost immediately looked away. There was no hostility in this. There was something else. Caution. As if I had already become part of the past, and they were trying not to step on me as they passed. In the elevator, I looked at my reflection in the steel panel. Gray suit. Neat tie knot. A face without the fatigue they attributed to me. I looked the same as yesterday. As I did a year ago. As I did when I was first invited to the board of directors. But inside was knowledge that is not reflected in mirrors. Age is not a number. It is a signal to the system that you can begin to be recycled. The office was on the top floor. A space where decisions are not discussed. They are formulated so that they sound inevitable. The glass wall opened onto the city, but gave it no voice. The secretary nodded without looking up, as if I were already accounted for in the schedule, not in the conversation. She is waiting for you. I went in. She stood by the window, her back to me. Straight posture, hands clasped behind her back. A gesture not of power, but of concentration. A person who is used to looking at consequences first, and then at people. We had worked together for almost 10 years. I knew her well enough to understand. If she calls without reason, the reasons are gone. Sit down, Mark, she said, without turning around. I sat. The silence was not awkward. It was measured. Such pauses are used by those who understand. Sometimes silence makes the other start justifying themselves before the question is even asked. We need to talk, she said finally. There was no thread in that phrase. Not even tension. Just a statement. But that is how corporations say the words that change trajectories. Not destinies, trajectories. Destinies have long been abolished as a concept here. I did not ask about what. The question would have been superfluous. At my age, the topics of such conversations are always the same. Succession, renewal, dynamics. Words that mask disappearance. She turned to me. Her gaze, direct, unguarded, but without promises. Not an ally. Not an opponent. A manager of context. Do you want to continue working? She asked. The room grew even quieter. This was not a question about a contract, nor about my performance. It was a question about my place in a system that is used to measuring people not by what they know, but by how much they hinder the next stage. At 60, such questions are rarely asked directly. Usually, it happens differently. You are offered to help with the transition, pass on knowledge, play an advisory role. Formulas that look caring and end with you being neatly removed from the equation. She asked differently. Not, are you ready to leave? But, do you want to stay? I understood. This was not an offer. It was a test. Not of my competence, of my inner posture. At that moment, I clearly felt for the first time what I had only vaguely sensed before. They were not going to fire me. They were going to rewrite me. Make me part of the narrative about generational change, where I am a necessary but completed chapter. Where my experience is only important as long as it does not claim influence. I am still doing my job, I said slowly. She did not nod, did not smile, just noted the answer. That is not quite what I asked. I understood. The question was not about work. It was about consent. About whether I was ready to be convenient at the moment when the system decides it is time to move on without me. Beyond the glass, the city continued to live its life. Cars, pedestrians, endless movement. Here, on the top floor, movement had a different form, not physical, but strategic. People here are not pushed. They are adjusted. I do not consider my presence temporary, I said, as long as my decisions matter. She looked at me for a long time, not as a subordinate, as a variable in a complex formula. I understand, she said finally, and in her voice there was neither agreement nor objection, Only acknowledgement. At that moment, I did not yet know who else was involved in this conversation besides us. But I understood the main thing. I had not been given a warning. I had been given a chance to determine whether I would disappear quietly or try to remain in my own name. When I left the office, the corridors were the same: glass, light, flawless order. But now I saw something else in them. Not a space for work, a space for selection. And somewhere deep inside, a question was forming that could not be avoided. Am I here because I still have something to do, or because I am not yet in the way? This was only the first step, but I knew, from now on, the system would speak to me more and more quietly. And in this silence, I would have to decide who I remain. She did not continue the conversation immediately. That is how people act who understand. The decision already exists, but it must be embedded in someone else's consciousness so that it seems natural. Not imposed, not alien. You know what is happening to the company, she said. We are changing the management architecture. Faster than before. Deeper. I nodded. I knew. Renewal was always presented as a neutral process, as if it were about software, not people. New markets, new teams, she continued. And new roles. There it was. The key word. Roles. Not functions, not responsibility, not decisions. Roles. Something that can be redistributed without resistance, because a role does not belong to a person. It is assigned. You have been a point of stability for many years, she said. That is valued. I understood that now would come what this whole conversation was built for: recognition, behind which stands revision. She pressed a button on the tablet in front of her. The screen turned toward me. Several slides. Diagrams, arrows, neat captions. It all looked like any strategy one had seen in recent years. Only my name at the bottom was marked differently. Not as manager, as bearer of expertise. We are considering a transitional period, she said. A more consultative format. Without operational burden. The words were measured. Not a single verb that could be called aggressive. Only nouns that gradually removed power from me. Transition, format, burden. This will give you freedom, she added. And allow the team to move faster. Freedom from what? From responsibility? Or from the need to consider me? I did not answer immediately. In such conversations, silence is not weakness. It is a way to make the other reveal the true meaning of what has been said. This is not a demotion, she said, as if reading my thoughts. It is the evolution of the role. Evolution. The word used to justify any selection. In nature, it does not imply fairness. Only adaptability. I flipped through the slides. Everything was logical. Too logical. There was no room in the logic for what cannot be measured. Informal influence, people's trust, the ability to hold complex systems together not by rules, but by presence. And who makes the decisions? I asked. She hesitated slightly. Team format. Distributed management. I smiled, barely perceptibly. That is, those who have already been determined. She did not object. That was the difference between us. I still believed in the need to call things by their names, she, in the need to leave them flexible. The office door opened without a knock. He entered as if he had every right to. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the confidence in his movements that comes to people who know the system is already working in their favor. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but there was no apology in his tone. I thought it would be useful if we discussed this together. This was Daniel Rowan. The very man whose name was increasingly heard in conversations about the company's future. Gifted, rational, without emotional attachments to the past. Not a predator, a strategist. And strategists do not attack. They build positions so that resistance becomes impractical. He sat down across from me, crossing his legs, and smiled. Mark, we do not doubt your contribution, he said. But it is important to us that the system remains flexible. Fast. Sometimes this requires redistribution of weight. Weight. Another word that turns a person into a burden. You are offering me to step aside, I said. He shook his head slightly. We are offering you to move away from a position of pressure. Retaining influence. Within reasonable limits. Reasonable for whom? This will allow everyone to feel comfortable, he added. I looked at him, then at her. And for the first time, I clearly saw the structure of what was happening. She was not the initiator. She was the conduit of a decision shaped by the logic he represented. This was not a conspiracy. There was no malice. It was worse. It was rational. Comfortable for whom? I asked. Daniel smiled a little wider. The team, the board, the investors. And you, I added. And me, he calmly agreed. That was the strength of his position. He did not hide the benefit. He simply did not see it as a problem. You can leave gracefully, he said. With respect. Without tension. This is a rare opportunity. Gracefully. A word that means without noise. Without a trace. That is how people leave, not because they are finished, but because the system has decided that their time should look complete. I understood. They did not expect resistance. Not out of arrogance. Out of calculation. At my age, resistance looks not like a struggle, but like stubbornness. Like an inability to let go. And if I do not want to leave, I said. The silence in the room changed. It did not grow heavier. It became more precise. Daniel leaned forward. Then you become a factor of uncertainty, he said. And uncertainty is risk. The system always seeks to minimize risk. He was not threatening. He was stating a fact, as calmly as one speaks of the need to cut costs. At that moment, I understood the main thing. I was not being offered a choice. I was being offered the form of my disappearance. Polite, convenient, one for which I would be thanked. You want me to agree to a role in which I no longer make decisions, I said. We want you to help the company move to the next stage, she replied. Without participating in it, I clarified. She did not deny it. And then something shifted inside me. Not a flash, not anger. Realization. If I now accept this as a reasonable compromise, I will cease to be who I have been all these years. I will remain in the company and disappear from it at the same time. At 60, you are rarely asked questions about the future. Usually, it is about how to formalize the past. But now the question was different. Will I remain part of the movement, or agree to become a museum exhibit of my own experience? I do not consider my role complete, I said quietly. Daniel leaned back in his chair. His smile became thinner. Plans change, Mark. That is how it is done. Not by order. Not by threat. By a phrase behind which stands the system. I left the office a different person than when I entered. Not because I was offended, but because I saw a mechanism in which I was no longer necessary as a subject, only as an object of correct completion. And it was then that I understood. If I agree, I will be respected. If I refuse, I will begin to be formalized. And between respect and dignity at my age, the difference becomes terrifyingly clear. The system does not punish immediately. It observes. This is its main advantage over people. It knows how to wait without doubt. It does not need to prove its rightness, does not need to justify itself, does not need to hurry. It simply creates conditions in which your next step becomes either confirmation of your usefulness or proof of your redundancy. The next day after the conversation, the office greeted me as usual. The same glass walls, the same light, the same faces. But the familiar geography of the space had changed. Not physically, by meaning. I felt it not in events, but in the pauses between them. Emails arrived with a delay. Decisions were made in meetings I was not invited to. Questions that used to be addressed directly to me now went around, to the team, to the new structure, to those very people who, just a week ago, looked to me as the final authority. This was not demonstrative. No one made sudden moves. It was careful, technological. That is how a system removes an element without disrupting its external integrity. And this was the test. Would I notice? Because if you do not notice, it means you are ready to disappear. And if you notice but remain silent, it means you agree. In the middle of the morning, I received a call from the process management department. The wording was neutral, almost caring. We would like to discuss your format of participation in the integration project, said a woman whose voice contained neither pressure nor interest. This is a standard procedure. Standard. A word that justifies everything. A small meeting room, glass walls, a table without traces of previous conversations. Across from me, two people. Not management. Not those who make decisions. Those who formalize them. We are reviewing areas of responsibility, said the man, leafing through papers. And it is important for us to record which functions you see for yourself in the coming months. Record. Not discuss. Not agree. Record. My functions have not changed, I replied. I am responsible for the strategic coherence of the directions. He nodded, like a person who has heard the expected answer. That is exactly what we want to clarify, he said. In the new model, strategic coherence is distributed among several roles. Several. That is, none. So you want me to stop making decisions, I said. The woman looked up from her laptop. We want you to focus on transferring experience, she said. That is an important contribution. Transferring experience. The formula behind which always hides one thing. You are no longer a source of direction, you are a source of the past. And if I do not want to become exclusively a bearer of memory? I asked. They exchanged glances. Not irritably, not tensely, like people who have encountered not resistance, but a deviation from the script. We just want to understand your position, said the man. This is not a conflict. Here was the trap. If this is not a conflict, then any disagreement of mine can be interpreted as an emotional reaction, as difficulty adapting, as a personal problem. The system never says, you are no longer needed. It says, you do not fit. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and opened my email. A new message from Daniel. Mark, I hope you understand that the current changes are not directed against you. We value your contribution and look forward to a constructive dialogue. Let's talk later. Not a single concrete word. Only a framework in which any protest would look unconstructive. This was the next stage of pressure, to turn the question of dignity into a question of loyalty. If you stand up for yourself, you are not a team player. If you agree, you are a wise professional. I closed the email and, for the first time in a long time, allowed myself not to reply immediately. In the second half of the day, I noticed another detail. The project I had been working on for the past few months had been transferred to a working group. My name remained in the documents, but not in the decision chain. Formally, I was still part of the process. In fact, I was not. This was not an attack. It was a test of convenience. At such moments, age begins to work against you. Not externally, internally. A thought arises that is hard to defend against. Maybe it really is time not to resist. Maybe this is the dignified way out. This is what the system presses on. Not fear. Fatigue. The desire to save face without having to prove again that you are still alive inside your profession. In the evening, I left the office later than usual. The city was already transitioning to evening mode. Lights in the windows, rare cars, air without bustle. I walked along the street and for the first time clearly asked myself the question I had been avoiding. Am I fighting for a role, or for the right to remain myself in this role? If the first, it is just a conflict over position. If the second, it is already a question of identity. Laura called me, not on the work phone, on my personal. Do you feel what is happening? She asked without preamble. I see the structure, I replied. It is trying to make me convenient. The pause on the line was short but weighty. This is the test, she said. They are checking whether you will agree to disappear slowly. And you? I asked. Are you inside this structure or outside it? She did not answer immediately. I am inside, she said finally. But that does not mean I am on their side. This was not a gesture of support. It was an acknowledgement of limitations. If I retreat now, I said, from now on I will be formalized as a decision, not as a person. I know, she replied. But if you go head on, they will speed up the process. Here was the trap. Retreat made me safe for the system. Resistance made me dangerous. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Then tell me honestly, I said, is this still a struggle or already a farewell, formalized without drama? Another pause. This is the point where you decide who you will be in this story, she said. Not whether you will remain, but who. The connection was lost. I stood for a long time, watching the stream of cars. People hurried home, unaware that in one of the offices someone had just faced a question rarely asked aloud. What is more important, to remain inside the system or to preserve yourself outside its logic? That night, I hardly slept. Not from anxiety, from clarity. When the choice becomes visible, it ceases to be heavy. It becomes inevitable. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. I opened my laptop and wrote an email. Not a protest, not an ultimatum, a request, public, for a review of the decision-making structure in my area with specific responsibility metrics. I knew this would do two things at once. Return me to the decision-making space, or finally mark me as a problem. This was my answer to their test. I clicked send and closed my email. At that moment, I was no longer expecting it to be easy. I was waiting for only one thing. Would they be ready to see me as a person, not an element that is time to optimize? The next morning began with a slight chill. Not outside, inside. When you work in a system where decisions are made quietly and remotely, any shift is felt instantly. First came the emails, project adjustments, role redistribution, Meeting notifications I was not included in. Everything formal, everything logical, everything calculated to seem as if I were still involved. But in reality, a step back in every line. I sat at my desk, realizing the obvious. The test was over. Now the escalation had begun. At 9:17, the door to my office opened. Daniel entered first, confidently, as if not noticing anyone but me. On his face was the same almost invisible smile that always hid strategy. But today it looked different. It was a signal, not a greeting. "Mark, we have a small meeting," he said, "just to make sure you are aware of the changes." I nodded. He sat down, not inviting me, and opened his tablet. Inside, resource allocation charts, reporting chains, project flow diagrams. My name appeared on all the slides, but as a label, not as an asset. I was not managing the process. I had become part of the reporting mechanism, an element that could be moved without explanation. "We want you to retain influence," he said, "but without operational burden." Everything correct. The word influence is a light poison. It leaves the illusion of participation, but in reality turns you into an observer of your own project. "I understand," I replied. "But how do you define the boundaries?" He smiled quietly. "Boundaries? It is just a matter of interpretation." He did not say, "You are not needed." He said, "Your influence is limited." And that is what defines reality. At that moment, I felt the real threat for the first time. Not the loss of a job, that already seemed almost inevitable. The real threat was that they wanted to erase my identity. So that experience, years of knowledge, understanding of processes, everything would become statistics on a chart. "And if I do not agree?" I asked calmly. He leaned forward. The smile disappeared. "Then you create uncertainty. And uncertainty is risk, which we minimize. Not a threat. A statement. Cold, like a formula. Minimize risk for whom?" I asked quietly. He hesitated for a moment. In that hesitation was something valuable. For the first time in all these years, he was not absolutely flawless. "For the company," he finally said. "For the team. And for the person?" I added. He looked at me. And for the first time in this conversation, I saw respect. Not friendship. Not sympathy. Only respect for someone who is able to understand the rules of the game and still choose their own moves. At that moment, Laura entered the office. That very moment when pressure turns into a test. She did not sit down. Did not say a word of support. She just observed, recorded reactions. "Mark," she said quietly, "this is a trial." "A trial of what?" I asked. "Of you. And me. And what we value. The system is testing who is ready to disappear without a sound, and who is able to remain without succumbing to the logic of disappearance." This was a clear formulation. The system does not test professionalism. It tests readiness to be convenient, to be someone who can be formalized without problems. I stood up and felt something I had not felt for a long time. Internal tension, sharp and clear. It was not anger, not fear. It was determination, clenched in the teeth, with a clear understanding that I would either agree or define my own terms. "I do not intend to disappear quietly," I said. "I am here to continue working to the fullest." Laura nodded. She was not supporting me. She was simply acknowledging the fact. My decision was made. Daniel sat down again. His gaze became more attentive. He understood. This was no longer a question of submission. This was a question of resistance. "Plans change, Mark," he said calmly. "And you must understand the consequences." This was the escalation, not direct pressure. Not an order. Not a threat. But a quiet, inevitable statement of reality, where your participation is limited and any attempt to step outside the frame is perceived as a threat to the system. I left the office, feeling that the next stage would be either a fight or a compromise that could erase me as a professional. And for the first time in many years, it became clear to me, losing a job is not the worst thing. The worst thing is to allow the system to define who you really are. I understood one thing. Waiting is no longer possible. The system had already defined my place, and not in the sense that I chose. If I remained silent, I would be neatly formalized, turned into a statistic of experience that no one needed anymore. At my age, waiting means disappearing. Too many years I have seen others leave quietly, with dignity that no one notices. Now there was a chance to act differently. First, I analyzed the entire structure of pressure. Not the people, their roles, the dynamics of processes. Who attends meetings without me? which decisions are made without my participation, which emails bypass my attention. This was the map of the game that the system considered hidden. If you want to stay, Laura said quietly over the phone, you must use your knowledge of its rules. Not anger. Not threat. Knowledge. That was what gave the advantage. I made a plan. Presence in decision chains. I began to appear where key projects were being formed. Not as a boss, but as a bearer of experience that could not be ignored. It was careful, step by step, without noise. Transparency of actions. All my initiatives were recorded publicly. Reports, proposals, analytics. So the system could not hide or reassign them without a visible trace. Neutralization of threats. Any proposal for redistribution of responsibility. I met with constructive clarifications, showing that I accepted the new rules but did not lose control over the result. Preservation of influence through communication. I began to carefully intervene in key discussions, asking questions that directed the process. Not too sharply, otherwise it would look like a challenge, but enough so that the system saw. Without me, the decision lost meaning. All this required precision. The slightest step toward aggression or open protest could turn me into a problem that needed to be eliminated. The slightest silence, and I would again become an object of formalization. I spent several hours analyzing meetings and emails, carefully choosing where to act and where to observe. It was a chess game where each piece was not a person, but a role. And I was the only player who still understood the whole layout. Never react to emotions, Laura reminded me when we met for lunch. The system loves to see irritation. It justifies removal. I nodded. Did not argue. But for the first time in years, I felt the taste of control. Control that is not given by authority or position, but only by clarity in one's own decisions. By the end of the day, the system's first reaction became obvious. Daniel sent an email, short, formal, but with an emphasis on teamwork and efficient resource allocation. No threat, but a clear signal. We are watching. I understood that I had shifted the balance. Not completely, not forever, but enough for the system to begin to consider me as a subject, not an object. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that the choice again belonged to me. This game is not about work, I said to myself as I left the office. It is about who I will be when the system decides that my place in the company's history is already in the past. The next day, I entered the office holding a list of questions and proposals for the board of directors. This was preparation for the final step, to show that experience is not just an archive, but a resource that cannot be ignored. Every word, every glance, every number, carefully calculated. I no longer allowed the system to control my presence. I defined it, and this was only the beginning. The morning began differently. Not noisily, not dramatically, quietly. So quietly that every step seemed like an echo in someone else's game. I entered the office, and the world, which had previously seemed impenetrable, suddenly became transparent. The board of directors was gathering in the conference room, glass walls, long table, neutral lighting. Those I had seen on video conferences now sat across from me, evaluating every movement, every glance. Not listening to me, testing me. Laura sat to the left, Daniel to the right. No one was smiling. No one was waiting. Everyone wanted to see who of us would hold the game. I opened the folder. There were all the numbers, reports, forecasts. Each word was prepared to show not only experience, but active influence. This was a map of what the system considered the past, but I was going to show that it was the future. Mark, shall we begin? Laura asked. I nodded. The first question was simple, but disguised. How do you see your role in the next 6 months? That very moment. The question that could become a trap. I spoke slowly, clearly, without emotion. I see myself as a connecting link between projects, as a guarantor of experience transfer, and as a participant in decisions. My goal is not to preserve status, but to preserve value. Not status, not position. Value. Words that cannot be ignored. The second question was about risk. What is your greatest risk? I smiled almost imperceptibly. Losing the ability to influence decisions without losing dignity. In that sentence was the whole strategy of resistance. Not against people, against the system that tried to define who I am. The dialogue continued. Questions about resource allocation, new roles, future projects. I answered calmly but persistently, carefully directing the conversation to where my presence was necessary. No conflict, no bright emotion. Only facts, logic, and experience that could not be removed from the equation. And then came the moment that defined everything. Daniel looked at me. His smile was thin, almost respectful. "Mark, your arguments are clear," he said. "We see that without you, the project loses meaning. Not gratitude, not approval, just recognition. I had become a subject, not an object." Laura nodded. Her gaze was calm, precise. She knew this was not a victory of one day. This was the consolidation of a position through clarity of action. The system took a step back. Not defeat, just recognition that I remained important. I stood up, feeling the tension not disappear immediately, but gradually. Not a victory over someone. A victory over the very logic that tried to formalize, diminish, and erase me. "I am staying," I said quietly, but clearly. No one applauded. There were no noisy congratulations. Only silence and attention. That rare moment when everything is clear and you do not need to prove anything to anyone. Later, Laura approached my desk. "You preserved yourself," she said. "But remember, this is not the end. It is the beginning of your new role." I nodded. Inside was a feeling of calm that did not come easily. It was not joy or relief. It was clarity. I had not allowed the system to decide who I was, even when it was convenient for it to consider me an object. And that was the whole point. At 59, you are rarely given a chance to control the finale. Rarely. So that no one notices your steps, except those who are able to see. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and looked at the stream of messages. The world continued to work as usual. People hurried, projects moved, the system functioned. But now I knew the main thing. The last word about who I remain in my own story belongs only to me. Not the position, not the system, not someone else's logic. Only me. And this feeling was stronger than any title, any salary, or any safe position.